41, cryptography, and we did keyed hashing last time, and now we're going to do authenticated encryption, and I've got a couple more RSA projects to demonstrate. So here's the authenticated encryption stuff. All right, so MACs are message authentication codes. That's what we talked about last week, and these are a tag that you attach to a message which provides authenticity. It does not provide confidentiality, but it means that this message has not been altered. And it typically has a shared secret key, so you also know that it was authored by the person who has the key. So you know who sent it, and you know that it hasn't been altered, so that makes it authentic. Now, authenticated encryption does a similar thing. It produces an authentication tag, but it also encrypts the message, so it provides confidentiality. And so it uses a cipher and a message authentication code. So we'll talk about authentication encryption, authenticated ciphers. The main standard, this is the only one officially government approved, the one everybody uses, AES GCM. And there are, as all in every section we talked about, this, I said you'd hear this over and over, there is a standard system that was developed a couple decades ago that is the official approved one that everybody uses, and there are a couple more modern ones that are better that almost nobody bothers using because the old one, although inferior, is still good enough. And so OCB and SIV are the newer, better systems, which there just is not much market reason to bother using them when the old system, which is good enough, is widely deployed and the standard. All right. So you do it using MACs. There's three ways to do this. You can encrypt and MAC. You take the plain text and run it through encryption and have ciphertext, and then you take the plain text and run it through a MAC message authentication code function and create a tag. Just two separate operations. You encrypt and MAC both from the plain text. That's one way to do it. Another way to do it is to MAC and then encrypt. So first you calculate the MAC, then you add that to the message, then you encrypt those two together. That's another way to do it. Another way to do it is encrypt then MAC. First you encrypt the plain text, then you calculate a message authentication code tag of the ciphertext, and then you deliver those to the other end. So these all get the job done, where the end result is you have some ciphertext, and you have a tag, and you can check with the tag to make sure that this thing has not been altered, and then you can decrypt it with the key and recover the plain text. Encrypted MAC is in principle the least secure system because, as we talked about last time, message authentication codes could use hashes that are not very random. Because you do not, the hash function required in a message authentication code does not need to be what you call cryptographically secure, where all the bits change randomly when you change input bits. It just has to be impossible to forge. And therefore, in principle, this MAC operation might not be terribly efficient at scrambling the bits in the plain text, and therefore you could leak information about the plain text in the MAC tag. In practice, though, it's fine, because in practice nobody bothers using those more efficient MAC codes. What they use is MAC codes based on things like SHA-1 and SHA-256 that are fine. So in fact, this is not much of a risk. And so here's how SSH works. Each encrypted packet C is followed by the tag, which is calculated from the plain text, and N is a sequence number. And like I say, it's secure in practice because the versions that are using, in fact, use SHA-256 instead of using one of those weaker hash functions, which could in principle be used for MAC. They just use an established strong function, so there's not much chance of anybody reversing a SHA-256 hash and learning anything about the plain text. All right, MAC then encrypt. So first you compute the tag from the plain text with your message authentication code, and then you just encrypt the whole thing. You encrypt key one with plain text and then append the tag to it. This is considered more secure because the tag, which might in principle have information about the plain text, is concealed by the encryption. So in principle, it's more secure. And this is, one disadvantage of this system is, if you want to check the authenticity of the message you receive, you must decrypt it first. And therefore, if an attacker is modifying the message and sending you malicious traffic, you do have to process it some before you notice it's been altered. And that is in principle a risk if you suppose that there were a vulnerability in your system where a malicious message could do some kind of harm on your system. You are in fact processing a message before you found out that it's been altered. And that therefore in principle has a is a possible attack vector from doing it this way. All right. So this is the most secure method. You encrypt the message, and then you put the tag on the encrypted message. And the reason it's more secure is, of course, now the MAC can contain no information about the plaintext because it's been through encryption. And when you receive it, you can identify immediately whether the MAC matches the ciphertext, and you know if it's been altered, so you never bother running the decryption method if the message has been altered. So this is considered the strongest system. All right. Although in practice, all three of them are fine if you actually use what's normally used for hash functions. The difference is not large, and this is why, like I say, there are modern, more better systems, but there are systems from 10 or 20 years ago that are really good enough that we continue to use because you don't want to change anything until it's really broken. Because you have all this software and hardware out there using the old system that's the standard. It would be very expensive to move to a new system, and there's not much reason to until you find a real problem with the new standard, not just a theoretical problem. So authenticated ciphers are the more modern solution for this, and this is where you carry two kinds of data. You have a key and plain text, and then you get an authentication tag along with the ciphertext. So this is combining them all into one operation. Authenticated encryption, instead of just putting out ciphertext, it creates ciphertext and a tag. And when you decrypt it, you need the key, the ciphertext, and the tag, and you decrypt it to go back to the plain text. So the previous systems amount to this, but they did it in two separate steps. All right, so this is the fundamental problem, though. This is what we're trying to do. See, authentication should be as strong as a MAC. It should be impossible to forge any ciphertext tag pair. You should be able to replay one probably, but you shouldn't be able to forge any matching ciphertext and tag. And then confidentiality should be stronger than a basic cipher because not only do you have to have the right key, you also have to be able to generate a valid tag. Your decrypting system will not accept anything unless it has ciphertext and a matching tag. So you would have to not only defeat the encryption, but you'd also have to encrypt the tag protocol. So that would make it even stronger than a basic cipher. All right. So this is what is the sort of the final gold standard for everything. This is the encryption system that does pretty much everything in this world that you need and what's actually used these days. It's authenticated encryption with associated data. So you feed in a key and plain text and then associated data. And the associated data is data you do not want to encrypt. It's not going to be confidential, but you do want it to be authenticated. So the output is ciphertext, where the plain text here got encrypted. That's the part you wanted to keep confidential. The associated data is just repeated unchanged because you don't want to keep that secret, but you have a tag here which validates all the rest of it. So if the tag matches a mathematical function of these, then you know that neither of them has been altered. So this you can use for many purposes. You can, if either C or A is modified, the tag won't match C or A. So this is a general purpose algorithm you can use for both tagging without confidentiality and confidentiality with tagging. So you can leave A or P empty. So if you leave A as empty, then you just have authenticated encryption. You feed in plain text and a key, and out comes ciphertext and a tag. So you've got encryption plus an authenticity tag. If you make P empty, then it's MAC. You don't encrypt anything. You feed in plain text and a key, and what you get out is the same plain text and a tag. All you're doing is attaching a tag so you can verify that the message came from the holder of the key and it has not been altered, but you are not providing confidentiality by encrypting it. So this AEAD can satisfy both of those roles. All right. Now, one problem with all this is if you have the same input, you'll have the same output. Like electronic codebook mode we talked about so long ago with the picture of a penguin that was still visible. Nothing here. If you have the same key and the same plain text and the same associated data, you'll just get an identical one. So there's a replay attack. I could take a previously sniffed tag and ciphertext and authenticated value, and I could replay it, and it would be accepted. So to prevent that, you'd add a nonce, a number that's used only once, and add that in somewhere. And then if you have a second identical block of plain text and associated text, you'll use a different nonce, so it'll be different. That's how you avoid these things. You just have to have some system of generating nonces that doesn't repeat, and you don't want to reuse the nonce more than once. That's what nonce stands for, number used only once. All right, So now we talk about what makes a good cipher. Here's the security criteria. Confidentiality should be as strong as a good cipher. So nobody can reverse the encrypted part without the key. Authenticity should be as strong as a good MAC. So nobody can possibly make a message and tag pair that will pass validation without knowledge of the key. And then you can consider how fragile is it if nonce is repeated. If you make the mistake and use the nonce twice, how bad is that? It would be better if even that mistake does not ruin it. So here's other criteria. You'd like to be able to parallelize it. So if you have a multiprocessor with 8 cores or something, you can run 8 parallel operations using all cores. We mentioned before, cipher block chaining is not parallelizable. You have to encrypt one block to get the initialization vector for the next block, so you can only do one block at a time. Whereas counter mode, where the IV just counts up, you could parallelize that and use something like a GPU with many parallel cores. So in practice, this will run much faster on modern hardware. Then you have internal structure. Some things are 2 layers, like AES GCM that we'll talk about, where you have to encrypt and then hash, so you have to do 2 passes through the data. First layer is encryption, next layer is authentication. If you can do it all in one layer, then that might make the code smaller and faster. It usually would take less room to write the code anyway and less RAM to operate. Then there's streamable. This means you do not need to retain the whole message. You can work on just a block of the message and then discard it and add in the next block and add in the next block and so on. And we've shown this is how MD5 and SHA-1 and SHA-2 worked. All they work on a block, then the next block, they never have to really retain the whole message. So non-streamable ciphers have to store the whole thing. That's usually because they have to make 2 whole passes through the data. So they have to store the whole thing, and that's more of a burden, using up more storage space or more RAM, depending on how you code it. All right, so some authenticated encryption forces the associated data to come before the plain text that's going to be encrypted, or maybe just after, or maybe anywhere. There's various systems. That's one feature that would affect your actual implementation of this. AES CBC now requires 2 algorithms, one for encryption and a separate algorithm for decryption. AES decryption has a different order of the XOR and such, so that's an issue. It might be nice to have one algorithm that does the same for both, like AES counter, use the same algorithm to decrypt as encrypt, because in counter mode, you encrypt stuff that just creates a key stream with the key and the counter, and then you XOR it with the data, with the bit stream. So you just do the same XOR to undo it, the same operation. So that will, use less room on your chip to code it. You only have to write an encryption routine and use the same routine for decryption. All right, so here's the one that everybody uses, the standard that is approved by the government, AES Galois counter mode. So it uses AES, and it uses this Galois counter mode, which is a version of counter mode. The original counter mode, they talk about just counting 1, 2, 3, 4 for the nonce, and you could do that, but of course that nonce is predictable, and so this uses a way of creating the nonces that is small and efficient and not as predictable is the idea. And this is what's approved by NIST. It's a NIST standard, part of the NSA suite, and it's used in all kinds of products. And like I say, it's not the most modern or the best, but it's good enough, and it's been around for a long time, and it's what everybody's using. And here's how it looks. This is AES GCM mode. You feed in a block of data, you take just the nonce, and you append a counter to it, 1, and then you use AES with the key. Notice that the plain text is not used here. You encrypt the nonce with you encrypt a nonce with a number, and then which is going to count, and then you encrypt it. That creates a bit stream. You XOR that bit stream with the plain text to create the ciphertext, just like all other counter modes. Then down here, you feed in the associated data and XOR it with each block until you get the tag. So the point of this is it's very simple, it's very fast, and you need a hash function h here to hash things, and that is a special polynomial multiplication hash function, which is fast and simple. And then you feed in the nonce with number 0 here with AES, and you XOR that in to create the tag. So these operations are very simple and very fast. And this is the polynomial multiplication operation, where you just take the number and add up many powers of it and do some XOR of a couple of those combinations. And again, these operations are chosen to just be very simple and very fast on modern processors, and chosen to scramble the bits enough that it has sufficient security. But one problem here is if you were to repeat the nonce, then nothing else goes in here, so you would have exactly the same key stream. So if two messages were encrypted with the same nonce, the AES part of them would be identical. So this part would tell you nothing, and therefore you can in principle get the authentication key H by just solving some equations. The encryption part is gone, and the only thing left is that polynomial operation, which can be reversed by just solving some equations. So like the one-time pad, using the same nonce twice is very bad. And this did happen. They did a test in 2016 and found a bunch of HTTPS servers that kept using the same nonce over and over, including 23 that just used 0 for the nonce all the time. And this is why they tell you never write your own crypto. Somebody wrote it, and they didn't pay attention and just left the same nonce everywhere, and that breaks it. So, you know, you're going to use a standard library that really has faithfully reproduced the official standard, rather than trying to do it yourself. You're likely to make some kind of mistake like that if you make it yourself. So it's the encryption and decryption are parallelizable, but the MAC is not. It's streamable, however. So it's moderately efficient. It's not perfectly efficient. And like I say, it's strong enough and everybody uses it. But here's the more modern ones that are better. OCB is faster. Offset Codebook, they call it, developed in 2001. And so it's faster and simpler, but it was limited by a license until 2013, so it wasn't publicly freely available. And what it does is it blends encryption and authentication into one layer. You have an offset key, and you calculate the offset from the key unannounced in increments for each block to create this series of O numbers. And then you just XOR it with the plain text, encrypt it, and XOR it again, the same number. And that creates your blocks of ciphertext and the key. And that's it. This is your ciphertext, the same length as the plain text, and there's your tag. This is even simpler than AES GCM and turns out to be secure enough and faster. So the tag uses P1 XOR P2 XOR P3. It just XORs all the blocks of plain text together, and then it encrypts that, and that's the tag. So it's very fast and very simple, and turns out to be just fine. So in principle, people could use OCB. In practice, nobody bothers because they hid it behind a patent, and everybody standardized on the other one. So it also supports associated data, another way to do it. We use a different set of offset values, and again, these very simple operations to do it. So it's considered less fragile in Galois counter mode. Even a repeated nonce will not break it very much. You'll see some identical blocks of ciphertext if you use repeated nonce, but they won't be able to deduce the key or anything. It'll just have the same input go to the same output, so it'll have the kind of flaw like electronic codebook did. You throw it, the OCB and GCM are similarly fast, parallelizable, and streamable. It used to be that OCB was 3 times faster because that G-hash polynomial calculation was slower than XOR, but now apparently on modern hardware, they're about the same speed. And Civ is another one. So on authenticated cipher mode, which you can do it with AES, even if you use the same nonce twice, it's perfectly fine. That's additional strength. You'll see repeat if the same, but only if the complete plain text is repeated in addition to using the same nonce. So that is unlikely. So it has an encryption function, a pseudo-random function, 2 keys, and a nonce. So use the pseudo-random function on one of the keys and the nonce to get in plain text to get a tag, and you encrypt the other key with the plain text and the tag to create the ciphertext. So the tag acts as the nonce of E, like the initialization vector. Another way to do it. And so it's not streamable. You have to do these things. You have to keep the whole thing in memory. You have to go through the whole thing twice, once for the first stage and once for the second stage, to create the tag and then to encrypt it with the tag. So that makes it slower. In that regard, it makes it consume more RAM or memory of some sort, but it's considered to be very secure. And the last one is a permutation-based AES that just scrambles things. Permutation is just rearranging pieces. Without using a key, it just reversibly transforms input to output It's considered quite good. It sounds like RC4. Remember, RC4 just sort of shuffled blocks of data like cards. And so you have an initial state, H0, you XOR it with a key and a nonce, then you permute it by just scrambling things around to get a new internal state, and then you feed in XOR it with plain text and do it again and again. That's what you do. Again, simple operations, relatively fast, and you XOR them with plain text blocks to create the ciphertext blocks. So ciphertext, same length as the plain, same length. Internal state is larger than the block size, this H number going by, and you form some bits from the last internal state to form the tag, which we've talked about before. That's more or less how SHA-3 works. All right, so you have to have secrecy of the internal state. You have to pad the blocks carefully, but it turns out nonce reuse is not much of a problem. It's single layer, streamable. You can use a single algorithm for encryption and decryption, but it is not parallelizable. Each block has to be done before you can do the next block. You can see here, I need the output of this block to go to the next block. I need the output of this block to go to the next block, like cipher block chaining, so it's not going to be parallelizable. All right, so what can go wrong? Authenticated cipher provides confidentiality for the part that's encrypted and authenticity for everything, so you know that it hasn't been altered and you know it came from the holder of the private key. So it must remain secure for all values of plain text and associated data, even if one of them is absent, if they're zero, if they're very large, of course, simple cases. So it must be secure against attackers who can collect many message and tag pairs and try to figure out the key and figure out how to make a forged one. And it'd be nice if it can tolerate accidental repetition of nonces, because sooner or later you will, whatever algorithm you use, you'll eventually use the same nonce twice. All right, so AES GCM uses a hash key over and over for each block. It has this calculation where it takes the 8 hash key to the n and to the n-1 and the n-2 and so on. And so the problem is you can have values. Remember when we did hash of a hash, and did the row method? There are some values that will hit a circle quickly. So it might, for example, form a cycle of 5. So as you go h squared, h cubed, h fourth, it'll repeat in a cycle of 5. So these numbers are not really all different. They're repeating over and over. That will create a weakness here. If it has a cycle of 5, then that means that the first block is treated exactly the same as the 6th block and the 11th block, because the associated parameter is the same. And then you could just take blocks of text and swap them, and it would still work. So that is a flaw, where you could forge a tag from the existing stuff by flipping blocks around. And this is something that we did in a simpler case with a DES ECB in the web hacking class. If you use electronic codebook, there's the same issue. If all you have is this encrypted stuff, and here's the plain text, you have you can take whole blocks and move them. And again, they'll decrypt for the same thing. And in this case, you could take 2 blocks that are 5 apart. These are 4 apart, but anyway, and the point is, this can be enough to really hack into something. In this example, it determines the username from this UID equals 0. Now, the original one was UID equals 1, which is a normal user, but UID equals 0 equals root. So all I had to do is take this block that contained a 0 and put it down here. And now I've created the string UID equals 0. So just being able to rearrange blocks, even though I cannot decrypt them, can lead to a compromise. Because it will still be decrypt, be accepted as valid, but it'll have the wrong meaning because blocks of text have been shuffled around. So that's the vulnerability that this thing will have, AES GCM in principle. If you were to have a value of the hash key that has this property of a short repetitious cycle. So in principle, it has a flaw. In practice, it's not much consequences, all right? Never seem to get all the typos out of this. There. Still didn't get it right. Consequences. There. All right. So, as you say, you can become root in principle in this one by just flopping a couple of blocks. In fact, this is not very practical. You'd have to somehow know you have a weak value of this parameter. You'd have to somehow find the cycle length. So in fact, in practice, it's very unlikely that you would find that. But theoretically, it's a defect of AES Galois counter mode. And another one is you can make smaller tags with AES GCM if you want to. But they're much weaker than they appear for long messages. And in fact, somehow I don't have the latest version of this, which is annoying. I figured this out. What happens is it's actually pretty simple. It's like the birthday attack. Since you're comparing blocks of data, it turns out that if you were to have like a 48-bit tag, you might imagine that you would have to have 2 to the 48 tags before you would find a collision, or 2 to the square root of that. But in fact, it's much less because you can rearrange the blocks up here. So you get to take 2 to the number of blocks over 2 to the number of bits in the output. That's why the length of the message matters. And if the message is very long, there's a lot of them. So it turns out that this is, remember, 2 to the 24 is 16 million. 2 to the 48 is a lot more, 256 million. But a 4 gigabyte message gives you so many possible ways to compare different blocks that it lowers down to 1 in a million, which is only 2 to the 20. So, like I say, shorter tags are weaker than they appear, but a 128-bit tag is fine. And so only if you were to choose to make these shorter tags would it become weaker. That's why I say everybody keeps using it. It has a few known deficiencies, but if you use it the way most people use it, you're fine. And that's why we continue to use it. All right, so let's take a look at a Kahoot. And I should have them here, library favorites. And this is 141, chapter 8, I think. Yes, chapter 8. All right, it should be in my favorites. 141 seem to have only the wrong stuff here somehow. I didn't hit favorites. That's probably where we are. 141, chapter 8. There we go. There. Fish today. Instead of monsters, crabs and squids and stuff. All right. That's a cute little octopus. All right. I guess that's it. All right, which one does not provide confidentiality? That's it, the E is encryption. All the ones with E in them encrypt things. This message authentication code does not encrypt anything. It just gives you a tag to verify the authenticity and integrity of the message. All right, which one is the NIST standard? Approved by the US government, and therefore the one almost everybody uses. Yep, Galois counter mode, AES. That's the standard. All right, which one might leak information about the plaintext? Well, this one, encrypt and MAC, because the MAC hashing might not be very secure, and this takes the plain text and delivers the raw MAC output. So this, in principle, could leak information about the plain text. All the rest of these, that MAC operation is then passed through encryption, so that conceals it. All right, which one can tag data for authenticity but not provide confidentiality? Now that's what this one has. This has the associated data, which has that property. You can have data which is tagged but not encrypted. You can also have data that's encrypted, but this A part is the associated data. So it has the ability to do that. All right. All right. So it's Greg. That's Fish. So, we stop the recording. I can get to it. Really foolish things keep happening.